abolish slavery, and the colonialists wanted to keep. So there is that counter-revolution, 1776.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. I left out that slide because I knew I was going to be short on time. But yes, there's, in addition to the sort of rewriting the story of the American Revolution by looking at the disputes between the colonists and the Crown over the issue of Native American land grabs and immigration, there's also a literature rewriting the history of the American Revolution from the perspective of slavery. That is, it is clear by the middle of the 1700s that the British are starting to see the end of slavery. Slavery is abolished in Britain itself. The British are starting to turn against the slave trade. And the colonists are seeing the writing on the wall. And the understanding that in order to maintain slavery, they're going to have to develop their own government and break off from the Europeans is very central to the motivation. And notice that the founding fathers are almost all slaveholders. And notice that in those parts of the Americas that remained colonized by England, say Jamaica, Barbados, slavery is abolished much sooner. That is, by the 1830s, slavery has been ended in the British colonies. So if the United States had remained a British colony, slavery would have been abolished more than a generation sooner than it was. The United States was one of the last places in the Americas to abolish slavery, followed only by the Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico and Cuba and Brazil. Those were the only ones that held on to slavery as long as, and longer than the United States.
Can I ask a related question?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Very briefly. In light of colonialism, why were the British interested in honoring treaties with?
Okay, in light of colonialism, why were the British interested in honoring treaties with Native Americans? Because from the British perspective, their empire was global. They were trying to play many different interests off against each other and prioritize. And they didn't feel like they had the resources to put into continuing Indian wars right now. They wanted peace in America to be able to focus on India and other parts of their empire. So the desires of the colonists were focused only on what they wanted in their space. The English had a much bigger picture in mind, and that's why the desires of the colonists were not their top priority. You're next.
I'm from Cuba. We have also our master narrative. The master narrative in Cuba, for example, says that we have no longer Native Americans there. The Native Americans were exterminated. But when you go to the very recent studies of genetics of Cubans, you realize that Native Americans are in us. All of us, we have at least 9% of us. As an average in the country, we have 9% of Native Americans. That means that immigration from other places, Africans, Europeans, came and they mixed it, they fused it with the Native Americans. We merged as a late nation in that direction. Are you having in this country something similar, some genetic studies similar to this?
So I would say that even beyond the genetic research, which is highly problematic in some ways, but there's also anthropological research, and I'm thinking particularly of the work of Jose Barrero, a Cuban-American anthropologist who works in Native studies, who has studied Native identified communities in Cuba in the contemporary era. So But I think that one of the things that I find really interesting, and as a Latin Americanist, sort of comparing how Latin American countries have written their histories of immigration versus how the United States has written its histories of immigration, that in Latin America, immigration, the 19th century state-sponsored projects of immigration in Latin America are openly recognized as racial whitening projects. The goal is to whiten the population. And almost every country in Latin America does this. Cuba also does this in the 20th century, after it becomes independent. So trying to improve the population, to whiten the population, these things are openly talked about in Latin America. In the United States, the exact same thing was happening in the 19th century. That is, in the 18th century and 19th century. State-sponsored projects to foster white immigration. But we don't talk about them that way in our immigration history, and that was really striking to me, and that seemed to me like something that we have to revise to understand. And that's part of why this idea that, well, we're a nation that's always welcomed immigrants just feels so twisted to me. If you look at what that really means, it means that we are a nation that has always tried to whiten the population through bringing in white immigrants and through defining immigration as the entrance of white people. So, finally.
Okay, so my question has to do with... Stand up, please. Oh, sorry. My question has to do with immigration law today, and the fact that having a green card is really the most clear and basically the only way to obtain citizenship currently. And I was wondering if you would still consider like work visas, student visas that are not actually pathways to citizenship as barriers that are still created to keep people racially ineligible for citizenship, like we have farm worker visas. So there are still hundreds of people migrating on visas, and they will never be allowed to become citizens through that, but we need them for our farm system.
So the quota system, the system of uniform quotas that was implemented in 1965, is for immigrant visas. An immigrant visa is a visa that allows you to become a legal permanent resident, and which, as you said, then allows you to become a citizen. Now, many people enter the United States legally on non-immigrant visas, like student visas or work visas or tourist visas, temporary visas. There's no numerical restriction on temporary visas. But that doesn't mean that everybody who wants a temporary visa can get one. So for an immigrant visa, because there are these very low numerical restrictions, in a country like the Philippines or Mexico, where there's a very high demand for immigrant visas, the waiting period can be up to 100 years before you can get one of those immigrant visas. And that is if you are in a preference category. If you're not in a preference category, that is a relative of somebody in the United States or have a special occupational skill, then there isn't even a 100-year-long waiting line to get in. Those 100-year-long waiting lines are for people who fall into one of the categories of people who are eligible for those 20,000 a year visas. So there's no numerical restriction on temporary visas. But the vast majority of people in the world who want one of those temporary visas are not going to get it. That is, you apply and you're denied. That is the experience of applying to come to the United States legally for the majority of the world's population. If you're a wealthy European, even if you're a poor European, especially if you're a white European, I guess I should say, you apply for your tourist visa and you get it automatically. If you're an indigenous Guatemalan, the chances that you will be awarded a tourist visa are practically zero.
You actually don't need, if you're a European, you don't need a visa to come here as a tourist.
Right.
Yes, you don't.
Right, now you don't.
And then they stamp your passport. And
Well, that is a visa.
Well,
When they stamp
but
your
you
passport,
don't
that's the
apply
visa.
for it.
Right.
You can apply for it, you're granted automatically because of your country.
So, so one of the things that's happened in the post-1965 period, I would argue, is that country has replaced race. That is, there are no racial restrictions on immigration now, but there are country restrictions on immigration. So the nation state has come to sort of stand in for race in terms of who can get a visa and who can't. Although, I mean, not completely, but to a certain extent. But most of the people, well, I don't know about most, many of the people who come to the United States with a student visa or a tourist visa do not want to stay here permanently. They want to go to school for a year and go back home. They want to come for 2 weeks and take a tour and go back home. And what we're talking about here leaves out another very large category of people who are people who come here with no visa. So I would say the inability to get a visa, far more than the ability to get than the existence of visas like tourist visas and student visas, is what prevents most people of color from coming to the United States or from having a hope of being immigrants to the United States.
I just gave a little talk on immigration, myths and realities to a group, and I'm totally embarrassed, and I actually was sort of figuring this out the next day, because I barely mentioned race, and yet, from what you're saying, race is crucial and central and the essence of immigration. Race is it. And I just don't want us to get out of this room because I made that bad mistake the other night, and I gave a talk. Bad mistake, that we don't get out of here without seeing that race is the entire issue. And as the Australians decided to whiten their population by choosing interbreeding, we simply chose another path. Like the whole purpose was exactly the same. And if you want to be talking about race in this country, then you are also talking about immigration. It's just
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, and then it seems to me the conclusion then is, don't be surprised that there are Trump people here. We are Trump people, and a few of us have veered away from that. But we come from being a Trump people.
Yes. Yes.
Given the current political situation, what would you say are the greatest threats facing the issues that you've been discussing with immigration? What are the greatest threats to connected aliens in terms of their livelihoods? What do you see this climate, because it's not just Trump who is doing this, it's just the whole sector of the population who's going back into this kind of narrative that you call mass together. So how do you see that unfolding?
So what do I think are the greatest threats faced by undocumented people in the United States? I think the greatest threats they face are detention and deportation. Those are the greatest threats faced by undocumented people. What are the greatest threats in terms of what's going to happen? What kinds of legislation is going to be implemented by the next administration, whether it's a Clinton administration or a Trump administration? I think that we have to recognize that the policies implemented by the former Clinton administration and by the current Obama administration have been policies of criminalizing immigrants. They have been policies of detention and deportation. So we can fear more of that in the future, but we can't attribute that to Donald Trump because it's a policy that was created and has continued to be implemented by Democratic presidents.
Go green.
In the back right there.
Yes, what do you think the role of religion played in immigration?
What is the role of religion played in immigration?
I'm thinking, in Latin America, Catholicism is big, and it's exposed to places where we call it Inquisition is actually means for keeping the Dutch away from Latin America.
I'm sorry, I lost that last thing you said.
Yeah, I'm saying that in contrast to the U.S., with the British, not the U.S., the Spain, the Spanish, British conflict, I'm exposed to the idea that in the Spanish, to a certain extent, enforced the position in Latin America to keep the Dutch from being successful in their invasions of Peru or Brazil. Is there anything comparable to that in the U.S.?
Well, let me say a couple of things about religion from different perspectives because, you could work on that. But so certainly the self-identity of the United States as a Protestant nation was built into the immigration restrictions that started to be implemented. That is, it wasn't only race, it was also religion. And just as I said that race is being sort of transmuted in legal terms into nation, there's some overlap between race and religion too. That is, Protestantism is associated with white English people. So all of those non-Protestant immigrants were considered not really white or not white at all because Protestantism and whiteness were also associated in the legal structures and in the mentalities of the rulers of the United States. From a completely different perspective, let me just mention that the Catholic Church in particular has taken a very strong stand for immigrants' rights. The Catholic Church as a universalistic supra-state entity has always had a very ambivalent relationship with the nation-states of the Americas, with the countries, the governments of Latin America. There's been a lot of church-state conflict over who's really in control of what. From the perspective of immigrant rights, the fact that the Catholic Church is one of the few sort of mainstream institutions that has been able to openly challenge the U.S. state on its immigration policies, I think has been very important. Even though one could also critique the Catholic Church on the basis of, well, it's losing members everywhere except among immigrant Hispanics, so of course they want more immigration.
Can you suggest, if you were the advisor to Congress or the president, would you do you see a solution? Do you see a way to
Yes. I see a short-term solution and I see a long-term solution. And the long-term solution, somebody who was just standing up over there who asked a question had a really good shirt on. You want to stand up again? No creo en fronteras. I don't believe in borders. I think if we want to think about a deep and long-term solution, we need to remember that the idea of nation-states with borders and the idea that sovereignty depends on determining who can cross those borders is an extremely modern invention. That is, the human race, we populated the planet by migrating, right? it is built into our DNA to migrate. That is part of the human condition, and we wouldn't exist if we hadn't migrated. So trying to control and prevent migration is a very, very new phenomenon, and it's one that's based on racism, fundamentally. So really, I think we can get rid of that idea. We can hope that someday we can get rid of that idea. We can get rid of borders. We can get rid of the idea that people move in to be controlled. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. So on the way there, there are several very specific things that I think that we can look at as small steps in that direction that will also help improve the human rights of immigrants in the country now. And when I say immigrants, I mean not in the restrictive version of people who are here as with green cards or on their way to citizenship. I mean all people who were not born here, who are here. Some of these things have already happened on the state level in some states. So in my state, for example, in Massachusetts, we're fighting for a couple of rights for immigrants that already exist in other states but don't exist in Massachusetts. The right to get a driver's license if you are undocumented. The right to pay in-state tuition at public colleges and universities if you're undocumented. So expanding the rights of undocumented people is something that can be done now. It already has been done in many states, and where it hasn't been done, it should be done, and it should also be done at the national level. There's some particularly punitive and harmful policies that have just been implemented in the last 15 years. Borders have existed for like 150 or 200 years, so it's hard for us to imagine undoing those. But policies that have just been implemented in the last 15 years, you'd think we could imagine undoing, right? So the whole immigrant detention system is very, very new. The overwhelming emphasis and quotas on deportation is very new. The militarization of the border is very new. These are things that we should be able to make the argument that we want to undo, and I think we should make that argument, because they will improve the human rights of immigrants and because they will help us think about our ultimate goal of not believing in borders. So I'm going to try to answer some questions more quickly because I see that our time is going and many people still have questions. Yes?
Thank you, Rita. There's another group of people which are children of illegal immigrants that were brought here as children. I am one of them. And we brought the program Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was in an executive order by President Obama. Is sort of in effect now, but what are your predictions for this program and these sorts of things for the future?
So did everybody hear the question? So in 2012, President Obama announced an executive action that is bypassing Congress and granting what he called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That is creating a very specific category, a specific slice of the people who are in the United States without legal permission to be here. Young people who were brought by their parents before the age of 15, who had been in the country for a certain amount of time, who were either in school or in the military, or so if you fell into all of those categories, you were granted deferred action. That is a temporary legal status for 2 years, and then it was extended for 3 more years. And so what's going to happen next? Well, when Mitt Romney was running for president, he announced that he was going to end it. Of course, he didn't win. If Hillary Clinton is elected, I assume I see no signs that she would undo DACA. I imagine she would keep DACA and perhaps even expand DACA. If Donald Trump is elected, well, he has announced that he would abolish DACA. Would he really? I don't know. I find Trump extremely unpredictable as a political actor. He says lots of things, but I can only imagine that if he were actually to take office, he and the people he chooses as his cabinet and his main advisors, like the British, would have some priorities. And I just can't imagine that abolishing DACA would really be a priority, but I have no idea. Yes?
I wanted to ask, what do you think the effect of free trade agreements are on immigration in America? Or if there's an effect?
Yeah, so that's just, the question is, what do I think is the impact of free trade agreements on immigration? And I would say it's not really what I think, it's what is true. I mean, it's what there is a ton of evidence about. It's not just my opinion about it. We really know a lot about this because we've seen what happened in Mexico, we've seen what happened in Central America, and we have information that can look at in a country, a Latin American country, in any poorer and weaker country that is brought into a so-called free trade agreement with the United States, and even in the United States, there are winners and losers in these free trade agreements. And in Latin America, one group of the losers is small farmers. And that was true in Mexico, it's true in Central America, it's true in Colombia, and it's inevitable. Because the way these free trade agreements are structured, what is built into them, is that Latin American governments are not allowed to support sectors like small farmers because that is considered an impediment to trade. So government subsidies to small farmers, guaranteed markets for small farmers all disappeared. We saw this happen in Mexico. Meanwhile, because the United States is the more powerful partner in these, and I call them so-called free trade agreements, because if it was really a free trade agreement, it would only need to be 1 page long. No restrictions on trade, right? It's not a free trade agreement. It's an agreement that sets up multiple rules governing trade, thousands of pages of rules governing trade, and governing domestic policies. Because the United States is the powerful partner here, the policies place restrictions on Latin American governments that are not placed on the United States government. So the United States continues to subsidize its agricultural sector, not small farmers, but giant agribusiness, so that Mexico is flooded with cheap, subsidized, genetically modified, US-grown corn. And Mexican small farmers migrate north to work. And we've seen a dramatic shift in the Mexican population that has been migrating since NAFTA was signed, so much so that David Bacon coined the term refugees from NAFTA to describe the migrants of the last 20 years. Well, all of that is actually in the book, but I just sort of summed it up in one slide here, so I went over it really quickly because I only had half an hour.
So, Aviva, thank you again. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for your generosity. We were able to, President had raised $450